I'm Dan, and this is SkyPilot Quest. Today we're dissecting a video clip of Charlie Kirk that popped up in my feed recently. He rather famously believed we were founded as a Christian nation, and just spoiler alert, right up front, we were not. Okay, briefly, in case you by chance don't know who he was, Kirk was assassinated in the fall of 2025, made national news. He was a right-wing political activist who founded the conservative student organization Turning Point USA, which his wife, Erica, now runs, and was the organization that created the alternative Super Bowl halftime show that also made national news. Back to his belief that we were created as a Christian nation. There are some huge problems with his position. And I'm even an ordained Christian minister. You might think that I would agree with him, but I do not. I really don't. Here's the big problem. The First Amendment clearly sets forth the principles of separation of church and state, and I'm guessing you already knew that. But Kirk had the world's simplest solution to that ever. Just say it isn't so.
Going back to this idea of separation of church and state, and again, I could riff on this ad nauseum because it's just so ridiculous, right? Is that it's not constitutional.
To his credit, and maybe the only thing I'm going to say he got right in this entire video, he got right the ad nauseum part, because I truly feel that in full every time I hear his thoughts. Back to his point. I know of people, white Christian nationalists, some of whom have messaged me to tell me how wrong I am, that I'm going to hell, and they, like Kirk, say we were founded as a Christian nation, and they rely on one major idea, one major argument, and that is the Founding Fathers' true intent as their primary argument that we were indeed founded as a Christian nation. Except, while he was president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, and I think he counts as one of the Founding Fathers, Jefferson himself wrote a letter, a famous letter, to a religious group, the Dansbury Baptists, who were experiencing persecution from another more powerful religious group, also Christian, in their state, who held a monopoly on political control, again, in their state. The Dansbury Baptists were being blocked out of the political process, and they were seeking help from the president. He answered them, offering his support, and he wrote to them a letter stating that the First Amendment had built, and you know this phrase, but you probably didn't know it came from this letter, built, quote, a wall of separation between church and state. Now, that is a Founding Father speaking on the intent of the First Amendment. And remember, those words were written by a man who is arguably the most famous and influential Founding Father in our history, and written as he was President of the United States 26 years after we declared our independence, so he had some time to reflect on their actual intent and whether it was being followed through with. Jefferson was clear, absolutely clear about his understanding. But back to Kirk. If Charlie Kirk had a public speaking superpower, and actually I really think he did, it's the verbal fire hose. He presents his positions in such a rapid fire format that you, as the listener, don't have time to process the information. Kirk didn't reason with you as much as he hit you with kind of a verbal barrage. You were simply knocked over by his torrent of words. And also, he jumps between ideas that are, if you slow it down and listen to it several times, only tangentially connected, maneuvering you to his conclusion before you can apply any sort of real critical analysis to what he just said. But when we turn off the fire hose, take a breath, and look at the facts, read his actual words, we do some analysis, his argument just doesn't hold water.
And finally, and this is the kicker, if the Founding Fathers were not Bible-believing church-standing Christians, why did they put Leviticus on the Liberty Bell? Not John, not Psalms, not Proverbs, not Genesis, Leviticus.
Okay, the passage quoted is Leviticus 25:10, and you don't need to be a historian or a scholar to understand why it was chosen. It simply contains the word liberty. Here's the passage here. Leviticus 25, consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you is to return to your family property and to your own clan. Now let's start here. The whole verse is about the year of Jubilee, a radical but really interesting idea in the Old Testament in which every 50 years there is a year of Jubilee. Slaves are freed, debts are forgiven, crops are not even allowed to be planted, while the land itself is allowed to experience an extended sabbatical and rest, meaning not be planted, not be worked, not be harvested for 2 years. So let's be clear. No one who suggested using this verse on the bell was promoting any of that. They just liked the part about proclaiming liberty, and they found that in this passage. So the passage was selected for the phrase simply because it says proclaim liberty throughout all the land, and was not intended in any way to mean we should study the theological context and actual intent of that passage as giving some sort of meaning to the future nation. So it doesn't really work as proof of our nation's overt biblical underpinnings. Here's another interesting twist, and I almost missed it as I was doing research for this. Kirk cites the passage that is printed on the bell, and then he quotes it. He says, it's the passage from Leviticus 25:10. Proclaim liberty throughout the land of which you are in. Those are the words he says, but those aren't the words that are actually cast into the bell. The words on the bell read, proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Notice the subtle shift that happens from the quote from Kirk. He changes the passage that demands liberty be proclaimed to everyone who's living in the land to a version that focuses on liberty being proclaimed to all the land, but we assume not all the people who live there. Now, another problem. Let's look at the timeline. Kirk asks if the Founding Fathers were not Bible-believing, church-going Christians, why did they put Leviticus on the Liberty Bell? Now, this one statement has three major errors that I found. Let's get to them. The first problem, when the Liberty Bell was cast in 1752, Thomas Jefferson was roughly 8 years old. John Hancock, he was 14. John Adams, 16. It is historical impossibility to claim that the Founding Fathers were the driving decision to put that inscription on a bell that was commissioned decades before the Revolution.
Sorry, Charlie.
I used to love those commercials. Anyway, second problem, he switches the argument by talking, again, really fast, a verbal sleight of hand, if you will. Did you notice we've switched the discussion topic by creating a straw man? He says,
This is the kicker. If the Founding Fathers were not Bible-believing church-saying Christians, why did they put Leviticus on the Liberty Bell?
If the Founding Fathers were not Bible-believing church-going Christians, why did they put Leviticus on the Liberty Bell? Nobody has said the Founding Fathers didn't go to church. Nobody said they didn't have their own faiths or that they didn't read the Bible. The argument here is not about their personal faith, and that isn't even where Kirk himself started this argument. Kirk started this as an argument against separation of church and state. Now, it's been flipped by him all of a sudden as an argument as to whether or not the Founding Fathers were believers. Of course, they each had their own system of belief. There wasn't, as far as we know, an atheist in the group. They were all believers in some form or another, and yet still they intended the Constitution to prevent the government from mandating or supporting any particular faith. We know there were various faiths represented at the Second Continental Congress, that's the one that wrote the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitutional Convention, that's the one that wrote the Constitution. Now, there wasn't a lot of religious diversity by today's standards. Amongst those who attended, the three most common faith groups were all Protestant. They were Church of England, later the Episcopal Church, Congregationalist, and Presbyterian. Those were the three most common and comprised around 90% of the attendees, I think. Rounding out the smaller represented belief systems were the deists, the Catholics, the Quakers, and maybe even a Unitarian. There's some debate around that one. As I said, it's not a very diverse group, and yet, in this case, they based our nation on founding principles that were remarkably flexible and forward-thinking. Second, consider the source material. Kirk mocks the idea that the Founding Fathers were anything other than Christians and argues they intended the nation to be founded on Christian principles, and does so by pointing out that the inscription comes from Leviticus. But think about the logic of that. If you truly wanted to prove the United States was founded as a Christian nation and that the founders themselves were Bible-thumping Christians, wouldn't you assume they would pick a verse from, the New Testament? I mean, if they wanted the Liberty Bell's purpose to be a proclamation of our Christian heritage and founding, wouldn't they choose one of the Gospels, arguably the most uniquely Christian portion of the Bible? Finally, Kirk ignores the most basic rule of historical research when doing, again, research. Where do we find primary source documents? If you want to prove the theological foundations of our country, do you look to the transcripts of the original Continental Congress, the words of the Declaration of Independence? Do you look to the exact phrasing that set into place our founding principles and are contained within the original Constitution? Yeah, he didn't do any of that. Here's what you don't do. Not if you want to have any kind of respect from people who are scholars, but it is absolutely what he did. You don't go to a quote forged into a bell in 1752, nearly a quarter of a century before we even declared our independence. His entire argument is flimsy, and when held up to any level of real objective scrutiny, well, it's just plain silly. So now, why is all of this important? Well, as an ordained minister in the Christian tradition, I've read the transcripts, I've read the Declaration of Independence, I've read the Constitution, and I can say with confidence, we were absolutely not founded as a Christian nation. Second, remember the church group to whom Jefferson wrote about the wall of separation between church and state? That was Christian against Christian. So you may look at this and say to yourself, well, I'm a Christian, so what's the harm? I will be okay. But the moment Christian nationalists win this argument, the moment they gain enough power, the very next thing they will do will be to begin to define who are the real Christians and who aren't. And then everyone other than them, meaning Christians and non-Christians, believers, non-believers, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, atheists, everyone loses. Finally, and most importantly, this isn't theology. It's power. The claim that America was founded as a Christian nation isn't about faith, it's about control. It's a way to decide who counts, who belongs, and who gets pushed to the margins. Claiming that we are a Christian nation isn't a conclusion, it's a tool. Don't be misled. This isn't a search for truth. It's a power grab, plain and simple.